I was down in the basement, working on finishing the recreation room I had promised my 15-year-old daughter, Janet. The ceiling and walls were already completed, and I had enclosed a section under the stairs for some extra storage. Now I was laying down the indoor-outdoor carpet that I had brought home last night. With my wife, Jamie, visiting her mother in Cleveland, I had the entire house to myself. Janet, meanwhile, was sleeping over at one of her high school friends' houses. I had spoken to her friend's mother, who assured me that she and her husband would be home at all times. They were good people and friends, so I was fine with it. As I worked, my mind wandered back to Sunday night, the evening before Jamie left. As usual, she had been angry with me and didn't talk much about her upcoming trip. All she said was that she needed some time to herself and would be gone for 2 weeks. Jamie hadn't been working since she was let go during a cutback at the bank about 2 years ago. Since I earned a good income, there wasn't any financial pressure for her to work. She decided to stay home for a while, and I had hoped the break would help her relax and perhaps mend the growing rift in our marriage. Unfortunately, it hadn't helped much. My name is Jim Schwan. I'm 50 years old and a partner at Harris, Schwan & Wilson Attorneys. Joe Harris and I founded the practice here in St. Louis nearly 20 years ago, and Margaret Wilson joined us 5 years later. We specialize in corporate law, and the practice has been very successful. I haven't been in court much in recent years, as we have a strong team of talented young lawyers eager to prove their worth. They all aspired to become partners, but since we had only added 1 or 2 partners in the past 17 years, they competed fiercely for every opportunity. I mentored them, guiding them through the complexities of corporate law while allowing them to prove themselves. Margaret managed the client-facing side of the business, running the office like a true powerhouse. Everyone seemed happy with their time at the firm, which was undoubtedly a valuable addition to their resumes. Jamie and I have been married for 19 years. It's a second marriage for both of us. Together, we have a daughter, Janet. My first wife had passed away in a car accident, and we didn't have any children together. Jamie, on the other hand, had a son from her first marriage. He's now 24, married, and has children of his own. He lives with his father, and while Jamie occasionally speaks to him on the phone, to my knowledge, she has never visited him. She rarely talks about him, so I eventually stopped asking. We had Janet 16 years ago, and she was our last child, as Jamie experienced complications during delivery that required a hysterectomy. This marked the end of her childbearing years, but we were both okay with it. Before Jamie's procedure, we went through the process of preserving some of my biological material, but we eventually let it expire without pursuing further action. Janet was enough for us, and at the time, our marriage was going through challenges that made such decisions difficult. Jamie's parents lived in Cleveland, and as a family, we used to visit them twice a year. Occasionally, Jamie would go on her own or take Janet. However, it had been over a year since either Janet or I had gone with her. If my memory served me right, Jamie's last trip to visit her parents was shortly after she lost her job. Rather than her mood improving as I had hoped, it seemed to worsen after her return. When she said she wanted to spend more time with her mother, I thought some distance between us might be beneficial, so I agreed readily. I missed her after just a few days, but it seemed she didn't feel the same way. She stayed a full 10 days, extending her visit from 1 week to include an extra weekend. With my parents deceased and being an only child, Jamie's parents, Jan and Ruth, were the closest thing I had to family. However, my relationship with her mother had always been strained. Jamie was more attached to her mother than her father, which sometimes caused tension. On the other hand, I got along well with her father, and we became friends, staying in touch through phone calls and emails. Unfortunately, this connection gradually declined over the past 2 years. I assumed her mother's attitude toward me played a role in straining my friendship with her father. Still, I never resented Jamie's visits with her parents. This time, however, her trip followed nearly a year of very strained relations between us, worsened after her last visit. Since then, she had become increasingly distant and critical. It felt like every day brought a new demand or task, accompanied by harsh words if I didn't act immediately. To my disbelief, things became even more challenging after that trip. Even with Janet around, Jamie's behavior remained cold and distant, making life at home increasingly difficult. Janet didn't witness her mother's outbursts toward me, so I decided not to intervene or react, trying to keep the peace. Over time, it became almost a habit to simply listen quietly to Jamie's criticism and walk away. She had grown used to doing whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted, and I allowed it to avoid conflict. I even let her behavior slide in front of Janet or when we were with friends. I knew people thought I was being passive, but it was a conscious decision on my part. Perhaps it was a mistake, but by now it was too late to worry about that. Jamie's approach to this trip was typical. After several days of hinting, she made the decision to go and simply informed me she would spend 2 weeks with her parents. There was no discussion, no questions about my plans, or any consideration of the challenges her absence might bring. She dismissed my request for an explanation and left me with a list of things to remember about Janet's schedule. But nothing more. The night before she left, she packed her bags and went to bed early. In the morning, she called a cab to the airport, making it clear she didn't need my help. She left without even saying goodbye. As for our intimacy, it had completely disappeared. We hadn't shared that kind of closeness in at least 2 years. Certainly not since she lost her job 18 months ago. In fact, it had been at least 6 months before her last trip home that we'd had any intimacy, and even longer since I had tried to address the issue with her. Every time I attempted to initiate something, she would get up and go to the spare room, leaving me feeling frustrated and angry. The more I pushed for communication, the more she resisted. Eventually, I gave up. One night, I cautiously brought up some options for working through our issues, hoping we could talk about it. Instead, she exploded with anger, warning me about what she would do if she ever suspected I was unfaithful. When I mentioned the possibility of divorce due to emotional neglect, she laughed and pointed out how damaging it would be to my public image if the court revealed that she had shut me out of the bedroom. Her reaction led to an emotional outburst from me. I asked her why she stayed with me when she clearly disliked me, wanted nothing to do with me, and seemed to prefer being alone as much as possible. To my surprise, Jamie burst into tears and cried for what felt like an eternity. When she finally calmed down, she told me she loved me, always had and always would. She explained that she was under so much stress and confusion that even she didn't understand why she acted the way she did. She begged for my patience and promised to seek help. Her pleas were so heartfelt and sincere that I was taken aback, sitting silently on the edge of the bed as she gathered her clothes and moved to the spare room. I was still feeling confused the next morning when she reverted to her usual critical behavior. This brings us to today. Jamie had been gone for a day and a half, and I had been reflecting on our relationship for quite some time. I began to believe that divorce was the only option left. Janet was old enough to handle it and would probably be relieved, considering how often she expressed her disdain for the way her mother treated me. I had tried to hold on for Janet's sake, but perhaps now it was time to let go. I still felt young enough to believe I had a life ahead of me, and I needed more than what Jamie was willing or able to give. The only way to find that was to let her go. The problem, however, was that I still loved her, despite her behavior and the way she treated me. I knew a divorce would likely hurt me more than it would hurt her. These thoughts consumed me as I carried some boxes down from our bedroom to the newly finished storage space under the stairs. Jamie had insisted that I clear out our closet, and now seemed like a good time to get it done, without her nagging me. On my third trip down the stairs, I nearly lost my footing. My foot slipped, and I dropped the 2 boxes I was carrying. I grabbed the railing to avoid falling and watched as the boxes tumbled down, splitting open and spilling their contents across the new carpet. Fortunately, there were no liquids or powders in the boxes, so there didn't seem to be any damage. I grabbed 2 empty boxes and began reboxing the items. That's when I noticed a packet of letters tied together with a blue ribbon. I had never seen them before, and my curiosity was piqued. Setting the bundle aside, I assumed they were love letters from one of Janet's boyfriends. After reboxing the remaining items, I pushed the filled boxes toward the storage area under the stairs. It took me 2 more trips to finish moving everything. When all the boxes were finally stored, I closed the panel doors and collapsed on the floor, leaning against one of the walls with my legs stretched out in front of me, trying to catch my breath. As my breathing slowed and returned to normal, my eyes wandered to the stack of letters I had set aside earlier. I pulled the letters closer and untied the ribbon, feeling a mix of curiosity and unease. The first letter caught my attention. It was addressed to my darling Jamie. Immediately, a surge of both anger and anxiety coursed through me. I had never written anything like that to Jamie, not during our marriage or even before. My breathing, which had just calmed from carrying boxes, quickened again, not from fatigue, but from the weight of the discovery. I unfolded the letter carefully. It was worn, with deep creases and edges that were nearly tattered, as if it had been read countless times. Clearly, Jamie had cherished this letter. I held it delicately and began to read. My darling Jamie, I've been thinking about the last night we spent together. I can't get you out of my mind. You drove me crazy. That was almost more than I could bear. And when you stopped, I wanted to cry. The way you made love to me was blissful. I know I won't stop thinking of you as you leave me to return to your loveless marriage. Why won't you leave him and come to me for good? You know my story. I'm also in a loveless marriage, and I would divorce my wife in an instant if you said you would come to me. Please, my Jamie, reconsider. Tell me you're coming back to me. With all my love, Walter. The shock I felt was so overwhelming that I think I sat there for almost an hour, struggling to process what I had just read. I scanned the words again, but they didn't change. My wife had been unfaithful. Her lover, someone named Walter Matthews, had written to her with passion and longing. The return address on the envelope confirmed his identity. Desperately, I searched the letter for a date and found it had been written 3 days after Jamie returned from her visit to her mother a year ago. I grabbed the stack of letters and opened another. This one described an intimate encounter in vivid detail. An encounter that took place in the front seat of Walter's car, in the parking lot of a club. According to the letter, Jamie had gone down on him at his request, and he had expressed his enjoyment. My mind raced as I read these words, unable to suppress the bitter thought of how much I would have appreciated moments like that with her. She had always dismissed those kinds of experiences with me, refusing, avoiding, even mocking me for asking. I wondered if she had felt differently about this encounter with him, or if it was simply her way of seeking something new, something forbidden. As I quickly skimmed through the rest of the letters, a clear pattern emerged. All of them seemed to be from that same trip to Cleveland. It appeared Jamie had met Walter midway through her visit and decided to extend her stay to spend the last weekend with him. He had begged her to leave me and come to him permanently. But knowing Jamie, I doubted she would have wanted to deal with the complications of starting over, especially if she wasn't certain Walter would actually divorce his wife. More likely, she insisted that he divorce first before she would even consider making a move. I couldn't help but question whether she had genuine feelings for him or if it was simply physical attraction, the very kind of desire she had denied me for years. I let the last of the letters slip from my hands and sat there in stunned silence as the reality of her betrayal settled over me. It was painfully clear that her infidelity had taken place during her trip to visit her mother, as confirmed by the dates on the letters. I found myself wondering how she had managed to keep these letters hidden from me for so long. Looking through the stack again, I found a larger envelope with her mother's return address. The realization struck me. Her mother was aware of the affair and had likely been complicit in helping Jamie keep it hidden. But that didn't surprise me. In fact, it all started to make sense. I carried the stack of letters upstairs and placed them on the table, my mind racing as I contemplated my next steps. It was now undeniable, my marriage was over. Up until this moment, I had been holding on to some faint hope that Jamie might remember the love we once shared, but the letters revealed the truth. Her behavior reflected nothing but contempt for me, and her indifference to my well-being was now painfully obvious. She was in love with someone else, but it seemed clear she lacked the courage to leave me for him. Given that Walter was also married, I wondered if she even believed he would ever leave his wife. I considered several options as I sat there, but I kept coming back to the same conclusion. I could no longer stay with Jamie. She didn't love me, she had betrayed me, and I had no desire to endure any more of her contempt. I knew I should wait and confront her when she returned, but I lacked the patience for that. This was the end. It had to stop now. By the next day, I resolved to enlist the help of a private investigator to uncover anything else I needed to know. Until then, I would begin planning my life without Jamie. Before I could move forward, though, there were two things I needed to handle immediately. First, I had to securely store all the letters from Walter. Those letters were undeniable proof of her infidelity, and as a lawyer, I understood their value. Jamie would eventually notice their absence, but there was no reason for her to know just yet how much I had uncovered. Above all, I wanted to ensure that Janet, my impressionable daughter, never came across them. The last thing I wanted was for her to be exposed to her mother's betrayal. Once I ensured the letters were securely stored, safely hidden away from where Janet might accidentally find them, I began to formulate my options. I knew these letters were vital proof of Jamie's infidelity, and as a lawyer, I understood the importance of keeping them safe. I couldn't risk Janet stumbling across them and getting the wrong idea or, worse, emulating her mother's poor choices. 3 days later, on a Thursday, Jamie called me. It was the only call I had received from her all week while she was away. The reason for her call? She needed a couple of things from the desk and wanted me to send them. When I asked why she couldn't just wait until she returned, she responded with one of her usual sarcastic remarks, accusing me of a lack of concern for her. Reluctantly, I agreed, still waiting for my private investigator's report before confronting her. I had contacted the investigator the day after discovering the letters, and by now he had been gathering information for a few days. During our brief call, Jamie barely said anything. She asked once about Janet, then ended the conversation without a single affectionate word, just like her. That was the last I heard from her that week, and I didn't expect anything more. At my request, the investigator had flown to Cleveland to dig deeper into Walter Matthews, using DMV records, city tax filings, and anything else he could find. The following Friday, just before I planned to confront Jamie, the investigator was waiting for me in my office. I told my secretary not to disturb us and closed the door behind me. He opened his file and began to summarize his findings. "Okay, Mr. Schwann, I think I've got what you need. His name's Walter Matthews. He's 45 years old, married to Mary Matthews, and they have 5 kids. Can you believe that? The oldest is 21, and the others are between 18 and 12. There are even twins in that mix. He and your wife spent a weekend together at a motel just off the interstate, staying there most of the day and all night. The investigator paused briefly before continuing. He owns a car dealership and spends most of his time there during the day. Seems to be doing pretty well for himself. Nice house in the BBS area, probably worth $500,000 or more. His oldest kid is in grad school, and the rest live at home with their mother, who doesn't work. She's a full-time homemaker. He slid a photo across the desk. It showed a tall man with dark hair, well-dressed and reasonably good-looking. He was more on the thin side than bulky. I stared at it for a moment, then pushed it back toward him. "What else did you find?" I asked. "No debts to speak of, aside from a mortgage on the house, over $200,000. Business records show regular tax payments and reported business income. He pulls in about $200,000 a year before taxes. Not bad at all. The rest is routine: his address, phone number, names and ages of his kids and wife. I've also got copies of his tax returns for the last 3 years and a few comments from his neighbors. They say he's well-liked and not a troublemaker." The investigator hesitated before adding, "Oh, and one other thing you might find interesting. He's a regular at a local establishment. I've got receipts from his last 5 visits. He goes at least once a week, sometimes more. The owner says he prefers younger companions, but they're all legal, so nothing that'll help you there." I interrupted him with a question. "Did he visit this past week or the week before?" "That's when Jamie was there. Like clockwork, he was there on Tuesday afternoon. And as I mentioned, he spent that weekend with your wife at a local motel. The rest of the time, he was home with his family. He went out one night during the week, Wednesday, when he met your wife at a restaurant. They sat together, looking very affectionate. Lots of touching, hand-holding, that kind of thing. Afterward, he left alone, and your wife drove back to her parents' house and stayed there." He continued, "Oh, and I overheard their conversation that night. She was making plans to meet him again this weekend. I thanked him for his work, took the file, and gave him a payment chit to ensure he was compensated. After he left, I sat back in my chair and read the report in full. It gave me a clearer picture of the man who had disrupted my life. Walter Matthews wasn't some desperate nobody. He had a stable life, a successful business, and a family. Yet here he was, pursuing my wife and tearing apart my marriage. The only thing I knew for certain was that I wanted revenge. Walter would never take care of my daughter, of that I was sure. Jamie, now destined to be my ex-wife, would soon find herself out of my life. That much was certain. It was Friday, just before Jamie was due to return. I sat at my desk, jotting down notes on what I needed to do, when the phone rang. I was so engrossed in my work that I picked it up without thinking, answering with an abrupt, "Yes." The voice on the other end was sharp and familiar. "Hello, it's me." That's a stupid way to answer the phone. "Where's Janet? I want to talk to her for a minute." I just stared at the phone in my hand. Silent. Was this the woman who had called herself my wife for nearly 2 decades? For the first time, I fully recognized how she spoke to me. Abrupt, dismissive, and full of contempt. It was anger wrapped in arrogance. Her voice dripping with the kind of disdain I had endured for far too long. In that moment, something shifted inside me. It was over, completely, undeniably over. I had no desire to string her along or toy with her emotions like a cat playing with a mouse. Even though I was a lawyer, skilled in manipulating people with words, I wanted none of that. Instead, I wanted to make her feel the pain she had inflicted on me. I wanted her to understand the depth of her betrayal and the consequences it carried. And I was ready to make it happen. As I sat there, reading those letters and reflecting on the investigator's report, anger and contempt boiled within me. When the phone rang again, I didn't even need to look at the caller ID to know it was Jamie. I let it ring 5, 6 times. before finally picking it up and answering with my usual abrupt, "Yes. What the hell do you think you're doing? Hanging up on me? How dare you?" Fury laced her voice. Good, I thought. At least she was capable of feeling something. Without another word, I slammed the phone down again, harder this time, and chuckled to myself. I waited for it to ring again, but when it didn't, I returned to my list of plans. The silence was blissful. It wasn't until almost 10 o'clock that evening that the phone rang again. This time, I checked the caller ID and saw it was Jamie. Curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see how she would handle things now, so I let it ring 5 times before picking up. "Yes. Jim, it's Jamie. Are you feeling better now? You seemed to be in a bad mood when I called earlier," she said, her tone almost casual. "I wasn't in a bad mood earlier, Jamie," I replied coldly. "I just didn't want to talk to you while you were making demands. Your constant lack of respect is what makes me angry. That's all. So, what do you want?" There was a brief silence on the line before she spoke again. "I'm sorry you got that impression. I didn't mean to disrespect you. I was just in a hurry and wanted to talk to Janet. I'm sorry if you thought I was making demands." "Fine," I said, my tone unmoving. "What do you want, Jamie? Why are you calling? I told you Janet wasn't here. What part of that didn't you understand?" "Calm down," she said, a hint of irritation creeping into her voice. "I'm not angry, now that you're being respectful." "What do you mean? Why am I calling? You're my husband. I wanted to talk to you, that's all. Why wouldn't I call you while I'm away from home? Don't you miss me at all?" I couldn't help but smirk at her question. "Actually, Jamie, it's been pretty peaceful here since you've been gone. No yelling, no demands, no disrespect. Janet is happy and spending lots of time with her friends. I'm doing what I like without anyone criticizing me. And when I go to bed, I have the whole bed to myself. It's not like I'm missing anything from you. Not for a couple of years now. So no, Jamie, I don't miss you. It's been very nice with you gone." More silence followed. "Are you still there, Jamie? Or are you done?" "I'm here," she said, her voice quieter now. "I guess I'm just surprised at the way you're talking to me. Have you been drinking? You sound very strange." "Not a drop," I said calmly. "Not even a beer. Just some coffee and a few crackers. Got to watch the weight, you know." "Well," she said hesitantly, "if I didn't know better, I'd think you were happy I'm gone. I was hoping you'd want me to hurry home, but maybe I'll just stay a while longer since you don't seem to miss me. Would you like that, Jim?" Ah, there she is. This was the Jamie I knew. Soft words laced with sarcasm, trying to bait me into an argument. But I wasn't going to let her steer the conversation. This time I was in control. "Well, I'll tell you what, Jamie," I said evenly. "Why don't you and good old Walter take a few extra days just like last time? He must have missed your company, didn't he? So rather than rushing back to your loveless marriage, why not make him happy a bit longer?" Before she could respond, I slammed the phone down again, this time pulling the line from the wall. I heard the other phones in the house ringing, the one in the bedroom, the one in the den, but they were too far away to bother me. I grabbed my cell phone from my jacket pocket and powered it off. I wanted nothing more to do with her that night. Her silence, I realized, was the best part of her being gone. I leaned back in my chair, thinking over the conversation. The only good thing she had said was her sarcastic suggestion for me to enjoy myself. That, I thought, sounded like a fantastic idea, one I could definitely handle. I went upstairs, shaved, put on some aftershave, and took a long look at myself in the mirror. Not bad, I thought. Not bad at all for a man my age. I was still in good shape, thanks to working out at the club once or twice a week, sometimes during business hours. My hair was almost completely white now, but still full, and I wore it long. My stomach had a slight bulge, but it was nothing a belt couldn't handle. Overall, I was doing pretty well for myself. Satisfied, I walked back downstairs and checked the voicemail, deleting all the messages from Jamie. Then I called Janet at her sleepover to let her know I'd be going out for the evening. I told her my phone would be off, but that I'd check for messages later, and she could call if she needed anything. She assured me she was fine and planned to stay at her friend's house until lunch the next day. When I mentioned her mom might be staying away for a few extra days, she seemed genuinely pleased. "Love you, Dad," she said before hanging up. "Love you too, sweetheart," I replied, smiling for the first time all evening. Before leaving the house, I took off my wedding ring, slipped it onto a piece of string, and hung it from the mirror in our bathroom. I wanted this to be Jamie's greeting when she decided to come home. Not that I expected her to rush back to her husband anytime soon. But more importantly, I didn't want to see any reminders of her tonight. Tonight was for me. I took one last look around the house, a place that once held so many happy memories, and then walked out the door. I drove across town to a bar I hadn't visited in years, a place known for catering to singles and being the go-to spot to meet new people. I knew the owner, having represented him in a lawsuit against the establishment years ago. I had won the case, and Carmine, the owner, had promised me free drinks for life. Tonight, I planned to make a dent in that promise. As I stepped inside, I was greeted warmly. The bar was lively, almost full, and the energy was infectious. Carmine spotted me immediately, raising his hands in a victory signal before saying something to a woman at the bar. She stood up, held her stool until I reached it, and bowed with an exaggerated flourish to indicate it was mine before walking away. "Well, well, if it ain't my main man, Jimbo," Carmine greeted me enthusiastically. "How've you been, Jimbo? Long time no see. What are you drinking?" I couldn't help but smile. "How's it going, Carmine? It's been too long. Bring me a bottle of the good stuff and leave it here. I want to get seriously hammered, and I knew you were the only one I could trust to keep me from getting mugged afterward." "You've got nothing to worry about," he assured me. "But tell Carmine, what's the problem?" I sighed heavily. "She's cheating on me, Carmine. Just found out today. She's been seeing some guy in Cleveland for over a year. She and her mother made a fool out of me. Real pieces of work, those two. When in Rome, huh? You talk the talk that Romans understand," Carmine said, shaking his head knowingly. He was a good guy, blunt, plain-spoken, and always direct. He set a bottle of high-quality scotch in front of me, poured the first glass, and placed it beside a bottle of beer. Then he pulled up a stool and waved away another customer trying to get his attention. "Go ahead, Jim. Tell me the whole story," he said. I started talking, letting it all out. 10 minutes later, when I was done, Carmine nodded as though none of it surprised him. He stood up, clapped me on the shoulder, and said, "Just go ahead and drink down your troubles. If you need me to do anything, just whistle, you hear? In the meantime, drink. I'll watch over you." He moved away to tend to other customers, and I sipped my scotch slowly but steadily. Time passed in a blur, and I was beginning to feel the effects of the alcohol when I became aware of someone sitting next to me. A hand brushed my thigh, and I glanced down, startled. A woman was seated close to me, her hand resting lightly on my leg while the other held a drink. I looked up, and she was worth the second glance. Her golden blonde hair gleamed under the bar lights, her bright blue eyes sparkling with intelligence and warmth. She was beautiful, stunning, even, but not in the way of a young girl trying to impress. No, this was a real woman, mature and confident, with a face that spoke of both character and life experience. I guessed she was around 45 or 50, but she carried herself with a grace that made her timeless. "Hello there," I said, always quick with the snappy words. "Who are you?" She smiled, and her voice was smooth as she replied, Hello yourself. My name's Rachel English. And you are? Jim, I said, raising my glass in greeting. And you are very beautiful, Rachel. Her smile widened, and I felt a pull to keep her smiling. What is a beautiful woman like you doing alone in a place like this? I asked, leaning closer. I can't believe you'd have to come here to find someone. Any man would give his right arm to be seen with you. Her smile faltered, replaced by a sadness that dimmed the light in her eyes. The shift was subtle but noticeable, and it made me feel sad too. I wanted to take that look away, to make her smile again. Why so sad? I asked softly. You shouldn't be sad. I glanced down at her hand, still resting on my thigh, and noticed the wedding ring. Your husband cheating on you? Like my wife? Her voice was quiet but firm as she replied. No, far from it. My husband was killed in Iraq. He was a colonel. His convoy was ambushed, and he died along with most of his men. It happened 2 years ago. I miss him so much. She bowed her head for a moment, but when she looked back up, her eyes were clear and steady. They say time heals all wounds, she said, with a small, bittersweet smile. I hope they're right. For her sake, I hope so too. We talked for almost 2 hours, sharing stories and learning about each other. As the night went on, we left together. I was too drunk to drive, but Rachel wasn't. We ended up at her place. While I'd like to say the night turned out as most men would hope, the truth is I passed out. The last thing I remembered was her pulling my pants off. I was interested in what might happen, but apparently the alcohol had other plans. When I woke up the next morning, I found myself in a strange bed, alone and confused. It took me a minute to piece things together. The events of the previous night came back to me slowly, and I realized where I was and who I'd been with. When I finally remembered where I was, I looked up to see the beautiful woman from last night, Rachel, standing in the doorway holding a tray with coffee and 2 cups. She was wearing a thin negligee that revealed more than it covered, and I immediately lost interest in the coffee. When she set the tray down, I reached for her, and she came willingly. The next thing I knew, we were sharing a kiss that seemed to last forever. Her lips were soft and warm, and we fell into it naturally, losing ourselves in the moment. When we finally pulled back, both of us were a little embarrassed, but she was grinning at me, her eyes sparkling. Well, wasn't that something special? I feel like I'm back in high school, she said, almost laughing at the look on my face. Yes, it certainly was, I replied, smiling back. Good to know I'm not the only one who gets swept away so easily. I couldn't stop admiring how beautiful she was. Do you come to Carmine's often? I asked. I can't believe a woman as beautiful as you would go to a bar and not have someone by your side. No man could resist you. Rachel's expression softened, but then her smile faded. A sadness replaced it, though it didn't diminish her beauty. Instead, it made me want to take away whatever was troubling her. Can I tell you the truth? She asked. But you have to let me finish before you say anything. Promise. I promise. Tell me, I said, leaning forward. She shifted, sitting up and pulling her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. She looked younger in that moment, so alive and vulnerable, like someone reliving a bittersweet memory. Carmine called me at home, she began. He's my brother. He told me to come over to meet a really nice man. He said you were in trouble and that I might be able to help. Her honesty caught me by surprise. She continued, her voice steady but sincere. When I got to the bar, you were already pretty far gone. But the more I talked to you, the more I liked you. And then, I began to feel something again. Something I hadn't felt since my husband died. That's why I invited you to my bed. I wanted someone to share an intimate connection with, for the first time in a long time. And you were that someone. Last night was everything I'd hoped it would be. Her words hung in the air as I processed them. She was being honest with me, and I could see the truth in her deep blue eyes. What she'd done wasn't out of pity or obligation. It was genuine. She had needed someone, and so had I. In a way, we had helped each other. I reached for her hand and told her as much, expressing my gratitude for the connection we had shared. As we sat and talked, I realized I wanted to know more about this woman who had walked into my life at such a strange time. We made plans to stay in touch, though she understood that my situation would keep me occupied for a while. Still, she offered her support, her shoulder to lean on or her company, anytime I needed it. I laughed, but I accepted her offer with complete seriousness. We shared another tender moment before I got dressed and prepared to leave. Rachel drove me back to Carmine's bar to pick up my car. The bar was nearly deserted when I arrived, and I wasn't surprised to find it empty. When I finally returned home, just past noon, the house was quiet. Unsurprisingly, Jamie hadn't rushed back to try to save our marriage. I felt a twinge of disappointment. I had thought that 19 years might mean more to her, but apparently not. I walked into the kitchen and noticed the answering machine light blinking. I checked the log and saw 10 calls, all from Jamie's cell phone. One more call stood out. It was from Paul, Jamie's father. That one caught my attention, so I played it first. "Jim, it's Paul. When you get this, please give me a call. Jamie and her mother have gone up to the cabin for a few days, at my urging. Jamie wanted to come home immediately, but I talked her out of it. They both have a lot of thinking to do, as you might guess. Call me on this number, it's my cell. Take care." Interesting. I call him back soon, but I wasn't ready just yet. Curious, I listened to several of Jamie's messages. Each one was some variation of her yelling, demeaning me, or accusing me of not knowing what I was talking about. The last 2 messages were less demanding and more desperate, but none of them moved me. I deleted them all. I checked around the house for Janet, but there was no sign of her. She had said she'd be back sometime in the afternoon, so I decided to fix myself a sandwich and a cold beer to ease my lingering hangover. As I ate, I thought about my morning with Rachel. Just remembering her put me in a good mood. After finishing, I grabbed the phone and sat down in the family room to call Paul. "Hi, Paul. It's Jim. Returning your call." "Jim, I'm glad you called," he said, his tone serious. "I know what's going on, and that's why I'm calling. I sent Jamie and her mother to the cabin to get them away from here. I'm furious with both of them, and I think you know part of why. Well, all I know is that Jamie has been having an affair with some guy named Walter Matthews. It started during her last visit, or maybe even earlier. And for your information, Paul, I believe Ruth knew about it as well, and she was the one who sent his love letters to Jamie here." "That's all I know, Paul," I said. "Well, yes, that's the bulk of it," Paul replied. "I found out by overhearing a conversation between Jamie and her mother. She admitted she was going to spend a weekend with him. That's why she called you to say she was staying a couple of extra days. I was furious with Jamie, but all she did was cry when I yelled at her. She's been crying nonstop since your phone call last night. She's going crazy trying to reach you. Her mother isn't helping. Ruth's been a nightmare, telling Jamie she doesn't deserve you and was smart for finding someone else to replace you. That kind of toxic nonsense. She wouldn't stop, so Paul paused, and his voice wavered. "I slapped her across the face. It was the first time in our marriage I've ever hit her, and it made me sick. But honestly, Jim, she deserved it." I could hear the pain in Paul's voice as he confessed this, and it made me angry. Angry at Ruth, knowing the role she had played in destroying my marriage. She had encouraged Jamie's betrayal, sent Walter's love letters to her, and had the audacity to justify it all as if she were doing the right thing. Ruth bore significant responsibility for all of this, but I knew she'd never see it as a bad thing. It was too bad I hadn't seen it coming. And too bad Jamie had been so easily led down the path of betrayal. It had been far too easy for her, and it shouldn't have been, regardless of how much her mother pushed. Paul told me he planned to drive up to the cabin to see them both that night. Before we ended the call, he asked if I wanted to talk to Jamie. I told him no. I had nothing to say to her right now, and perhaps I never would. I needed time to think about it all. He understood, and we hung up. About an hour later, Janet came home. Rather than dance around the issue, I decided to tell her what I knew about her mother's actions. It wasn't done out of cruelty, but out of respect. Janet was growing up so fast, and she had already seen the strain in our marriage. She was caught in the middle, and I wanted her to be aware of what was happening so she could make informed decisions about her own life. If the marriage ended, she would be old enough to decide where she wanted to live. We talked through the pros and cons of each choice. It wasn't an emotional conversation, but a practical one. Janet was almost an adult, and I wanted her to do what was best for her now and in the future. We talked for hours, and I couldn't have been prouder of how she handled it. She was calm, thoughtful, and mature beyond her years. In the end, we both decided it would be best for her to stay here at the house with her mother. School, activities, and other responsibilities would require someone who had the flexibility to be around, and I couldn't provide that. I promised Janet I would always ensure she was cared for and that her education and future would never be jeopardized. It was close to 5 o'clock when the phone rang. Janet took the call, and I heard her say, "Mom, how could you?" I decided to let her speak with her mother first and stepped outside to sit on the porch. I hated that she had to deal with this, but our choices would affect her life, and she deserved to be part of the process. I was still contemplating how I wanted to handle everything when Janet came outside, the phone in her hand. "Here, Dad, sir. I don't want to talk to her again," she said, her voice trembling, tears in her eyes. I wanted to comfort her, but she handed me the phone and walked away quickly, leaving me alone, just as I had left her to handle the initial conversation with her mother. I watched her go, feeling a pang of guilt, but I knew she needed space. I lifted the phone to my ear and said, "Hello, Jamie." Just that, nothing more. I was already exhausted by the entire situation. It had only been 24 hours, give or take, but it felt like weeks of turmoil compressed into a single day. "Why did you have to tell Janet? Why were you so cruel? Just to hurt me? Just to get back at me?" Jamie's voice was sharp, defensive, back to her old self. She couldn't take responsibility for anything. Lashing out was easier for her than admitting fault. I was fed up. "Go to hell," I snapped. "When you can talk to me decently, call me. Otherwise, don't bother to call or come back here. Goodbye." I disconnected the call and held the phone limply in my hand, waiting to see if she would try again. It didn't take long. The phone rang again. "Hello," I answered, my voice drained. "Jim, I apologize," she said, her tone subdued. "I was just shaken that you told Janet what I did. I don't know why you had to do that. I guess it's because you hate me now, isn't it?" "Actually, Jamie, not everything is about you," I replied calmly but firmly. "You may not believe me, but why I told her had nothing to do with you. What you did is going to affect her life as well as mine. She deserved to be treated with the respect you've denied me all this time. I told her because she has a right to know, and she deserves time to learn how to deal with it." Jamie was silent on the other end of the line, and I let the moment linger. Finally, she said quietly, "I see. I guess I didn't think of it that way." "Of course you didn't," I said flatly. "You've only thought about yourself throughout all of this. But Janet has to live with the fallout of your decisions, and I won't let her be blindsided. That's why. And as for your apology, Jamie, Save it. There was a pause. I could tell she was processing what I had just said. Then, in a quiet voice, she asked, "Do you hate me, Jim?" "No, I don't hate you," I said honestly. "To be honest, I have no emotions when I think of you. These past 2 years have drained me of everything. They've just about killed all the love or any emotion I ever had for you. I guess I do feel some anger when I think of you and him, but even that will fade. You've done a good job of erasing whatever I had left for us inside me. Would you believe me if I told you I'm sorry?" Jamie said, her voice trembling. "That I wish it had never happened? I am so sorry that I let it happen. You didn't deserve this, Jim. I'm really, really sorry." "Well," I replied, my voice steady but detached. "Like I said, Jamie, there's just a void inside me now, a void that used to be filled with thoughts of you. Now it's empty. You asked me the other night if I missed you. The answer, more and more, is becoming no. And you're right, you should never have allowed it to happen. That's what our marriage vows were about. Do you remember those promises? Forsaking all others? You broke those vows, and now I have to accept that there's nothing left." There was a long pause before she whispered, "Please tell me you don't mean that, Jim. Please tell me you don't feel that way. I'll be home as soon as I can, and we can work this out. I know I've done something awful, but I'll make it up to you if you just give me the chance." "I don't want to make it work anymore, Jamie," I said coldly. "I would prefer if you just stayed away for a while longer. These past few days have been very peaceful for me. I'm doing quite well without you now. Janet and I have some decisions to make about her future, and she'll make those decisions herself. I'm not going to influence her. She should probably stay here with you if she can. She only has a year and a few months left of school." "Jim," she said, her voice breaking. "You're talking as if it's over between us. Please don't make any decisions like that until I have a chance to talk to you. I know I've messed up big time, but I can make it up to you if you'll only give me a chance. Jim, I realize now that I love you more than I ever understood. I forgot for a while, but now I remember why I loved you. I don't want to lose you. Please wait for me, Jim. Wait until I get home." I let her words hang in the air for a moment before replying, "I have no interest in your love for me, Jamie. Your love means nothing to me anymore. I would rather stay away from it for the rest of my life. As far as I'm concerned, this marriage is over. And like I said, don't bother coming home right away." Before she could say anything more, I hung up the phone. Tears stung my eyes as I heard her begin to plead, but I refused to let myself listen any longer. It was just an echo of the love I had once felt for Jamie, a love that she had destroyed. That love would die a quick death, but for now, I still had to endure the pain of separation. The phone began to ring almost immediately after I hung up. Glancing at the caller ID, I saw it was Jamie, but I ignored it. I was done talking to her. I was done with her. That fact was becoming clearer with every passing moment as the enormity of her betrayal sank in. It was almost noon the following Wednesday when my secretary, Susie, rang me to let me know I had a phone call from my wife. It had been 2 days since I informed her not to accept any calls from Jamie, so this was unexpected. "Why did you take the call?" I asked, annoyed. "It was forwarded by Margaret Wilson," Susie said hesitantly. "Margaret? Hell, I had forgotten that Jamie and Margaret were friends. Margaret was a real piece of work. She had been married and divorced 4 times already. She was hardly the role model I wanted around my soon-to-be ex-wife. I always wondered why Jamie and Margaret had hit it off so well. Now I was beginning to see they were 2 of a kind. Okay, I'll take it," I sighed. "Not your fault, Susie." I pressed the button for line 1. "Yes? What is it?" "And this had better be good, Margaret." I could hear Margaret's voice on the other end. "Oh, Jim. I had no idea there were problems. But what the hell are you doing? You won't even talk to your wife. She's on the line. When I hang up, talk to her. I rolled my eyes as she disconnected, and Jamie's voice came on the line. Hello, Jamie, I said evenly. What can I do for you? You can come home and talk to me, she replied quickly. I'm at home, Jim. So please, can we talk? Whose home is that, Jamie? I asked coldly. Walter Matthews' home? Because it's certainly not our home anymore. You've destroyed that one, haven't you? I heard a muffled sob on the other end of the line. So, she had decided to go for the tactic of begging. Jim, please come home and talk to me. I owe you an explanation, and I promise to give it to you, without any lies or excuses. Please, Jim, come home, Jamie pleaded. What do you really want, Jamie? Just to be taken care of while you do whatever you please behind my back? Isn't that what you've been doing for the past 2 years? You treat me poorly, refuse to communicate, make my life a living hell, and then you go to him. You said you were visiting your mother, but you went to him instead. You made plans to spend the weekend with him again, just like last time, and then you insulted me until I agreed to let you stay longer. You were trying to use me to justify your choices. Was it that much better with him? I wasn't holding back now. The anger that had been simmering for days finally had an outlet. And now that Jamie was on the other end of the line, she became the target. Please, Jim, Jamie stammered. I guess I deserve that, but you're wrong. You're wrong about Walter and me. I didn't even see him this trip. Honest. Jamie, I said coldly. You spent the whole weekend with him at the Dorchester Hotel. And what about Wednesday? Doesn't dinner on Wednesday night count? You made plans to meet him over the coming weekend. You told him you were going to convince me to let you stay a few extra days. Sitting close together, touching, and God knows what else under the table. Or do you not count those moments as seeing him? Is that how you justify it? I just met him briefly, she stammered, to tell him it was over, that I never wanted to see him again. Honest, Jim, I didn't go anywhere with him. That was the only time I saw him. More lies, Jamie, I snapped. I know what you did. And what about the last trip? Didn't you have a close encounter in the parking lot? Do you deny any of that? Her silence was deafening. The truth was beginning to crush her now, and I could feel it. Finally, I had the upper hand. I pressed on, feeling a grim satisfaction. Did you and Walter talk about his kids? His twins? Did he mention them? How about his wife, Margaret? Did you two talk about her? Did you tell him about me? Did you laugh together about how you were pulling the wool over my eyes? There was a sudden, loud scream on the other end of the line that startled me. I instinctively held the phone away from my ear, but the click that followed told me she had hung up. I set the phone down, feeling exhausted. The release of all that anger left me limp, like a wet rag. I had 2 choices. I could go home and talk to Jamie, let her try to justify what she had done. Or I could begin making plans to end this charade of a marriage while the pain and anger were still burning inside me. I chose the latter. I called 2 of my associates, both trusted lawyers in my firm, and briefed them on my situation. Once I began treating this as a legal case, something I had done countless times over the past 20 years, it became easier to manage. The only difference this time was that my name was on the file. They quickly got down to business, forgetting it was their boss's wife we were dealing with. That's exactly what I needed: detachment and professionalism. The first step was to file suit in Ohio for alienation of affections. It was a rare but legitimate legal charge, and I intended to pursue it to the bitter end. I knew I would probably lose, but I didn't care about the money. What I wanted was to put Walter Matthews in court, to make him answer for his actions in front of his wife and children. She deserved to know what her husband was capable of, and then she could decide what to do with him. I handed the stack of love letters to one of my associates and instructed him to prepare a motion for handwriting analysis to confirm they came from Walter Matthews. After reading the top one, he smiled grimly and tucked them into his briefcase. He was flying to Cleveland the next day to file the motion and get the process started. The other associate and I outlined a series of actions to protect my assets. We planned to close certain accounts, transfer funds, and conduct an outside audit of my holdings. We estimated their value and decided how to reposition certain assets before the audit to ensure minimal losses. I signed a power of attorney, sat back, and watched him begin the process. These two associates were relentless when given a task, and I was counting on that. My goal was maximum pain for them with minimal loss to me. By the end of the day, things were already in motion. As I walked down the hall toward my car, I realized how much the anger was fueling me. When love morphs into hate, I thought, there's no limit to the pain it can inflict. When I walked into the house that evening, I found Jamie sitting on the couch in the family room with Janet. Janet's eyes were red and swollen from crying, and Jamie didn't look much better. Both of them turned toward me as I entered the room. Janet jumped up and ran to me, throwing her arms around me. She whispered into my ear, "Good luck, Dad. Whatever happens, I love you." I held her close, kissed her on the forehead, and watched her walk away. Her head was held high, but her pace betrayed the pain she was feeling. She was strong, nothing like her mother, and I knew she would be okay no matter what happened. I turned back to Jamie, who was still sitting on the couch, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked at me, searching for something in my expression, but I had nothing to give her. It was time to begin the process of separating myself from her. She had started this, but I was going to finish it, and that thought gave me peace. I sighed, walked into the room, and sat down in one of the matching chairs Jamie had picked out back when she was still in couples mode. The chairs and couch matched perfectly, and I hated them both. "Well, Jamie, I'm here," I said, settling into the seat. "You wanted to talk to me. Tell me why you messed up our lives. Why did you betray Janet and me?" Jamie looked at me, her expression already strained. "I don't know," she said, her voice quiet. "I know that's not an answer, but it's the truth. I just don't know why I did it. I went home the first time just to get away from everything. I had no intention of doing anything, but just escaping for a while. That's all I wanted at first." Her words sounded rehearsed, but I stayed quiet, letting her speak. I wanted to hear every justification she had prepared. For the first week, that's all I did. Just stayed with my mother and got away from everything here. Then Mom introduced me to this man. Jamie continued, her voice steady now. She said he was a friend of hers from church. She told me he was in a bad marriage and asked if I'd talk to him. I stared at her, listening, but I wasn't buying it. I couldn't imagine what she expected me to say that would justify her actions. Still, curiosity kept me seated. "We went to dinner that Friday," Jamie went on, "the night before I was supposed to fly home. We talked, and he was very charming. He complimented me a lot, touched my hand when he spoke, and even reached over to push a lock of hair off my face. He was very smooth, and I was swept away. As the evening went on, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not even with you." She paused, glancing at me as if to gauge my reaction, but I stayed silent, my anger burning beneath the surface. She took a deep breath and continued. "I know now that it was wrong, so very wrong, but by the end of the evening I wanted him. I wanted him badly. You know, we hadn't been intimate for months before I went home. My drive, I guess you could call it, was almost gone. But that night with him, it came back. He saw that and he drove me to a motel. We spent the night together." Her words were like daggers, each one driving deeper into my chest. She paused, tears starting to form in her eyes, but I said nothing. She wiped them away and kept going. The next day, I called you and told you I was staying a couple of extra days. I spent them with Walter at that motel. The anger inside me grew white-hot as she spoke. The pain of her betrayal felt unbearable. I wanted to get up and walk out, but I refused to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I sat there, pretending to be in control, while inwardly I wanted to lash out. Only my restraint and my training stopped me from doing so. I came home, Jamie said, her voice trembling now. And I never told you about Walter. I didn't call him or talk to him or write to him afterward. I tried to forget what I had done. But I also never came to you for intimacy either, mostly because I thought you'd somehow know. I couldn't risk that. You may not believe me, Jim, but I do love you. And I'm so ashamed of what I've done. So ashamed that I think I might just die. She stopped, tears falling freely now. Her head hung low, her voice breaking with emotion. While I believed her shame was real, I believed nothing else. Not her love for me, not her reasons for betraying me, not her fear of me finding out. None of it rang true to me. Well, I said, my voice cold, that's quite a story, Jamie. Why don't I believe a word of it? She looked up, startled. What? Jim, I'm telling you the truth. No, you're not, I snapped. And I'll tell you why. First, you shut me out long before you left for your mother's. You were already treating me like garbage back then. Second, I know some of the things you did with him, and they're things you'd never even considered doing with me. Why is that, Jamie? Why give to him what you refused me? Why were those things okay for him but not for me? She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. I was on a roll now, and the anger I had been suppressing for so long was boiling over. You were going to do it again, weren't you? This time I had you investigated. I know you met him the first weekend of your trip and spent time with him. I know about Wednesday night, Jamie. I know you had dinner with him, made plans to spend the weekend together again, and then tried to convince me to let you stay longer so you could be with him. I was breathing hard now, my chest heaving, my fists clenched so tightly that my knuckles were white. She stared at me wide-eyed, as the fury in my eyes burned through her, but I wasn't done. You've denied me your body and your heart for almost 2 years. You've denied me your love and affection for even longer. And to make it worse, you gave it to someone else. You did things with him that you refused me. You gave him parts of yourself that you told me were too much to try. You betrayed me, not just with your infidelity, but with the way you stripped me of my rights as your husband and gave them to someone else. Her tears were streaming down her face now, but I had no sympathy left to give her. And your mother, I continued, my voice icy. She was part of this too. I know she never liked me, but what I don't understand is what she had against his wife and children. She must have known Margaret might find out, that his marriage would be destroyed. But she didn't care. She didn't care about our marriage or his. She's always hated me, and she led you down this path of betrayal without a second thought. And you followed her without so much as a whimper. It was too easy for you, Jamie. Too damn easy. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. My voice was calmer now, but it carried the weight of finality. That's why I know it's over, Jamie. It shouldn't have been this easy for you to betray me, but it was. What convinced me that there's no love left in this marriage? You just realized it first, Jamie. I had to find out the hard way. Jamie jumped up, closing the distance between us, her arms outstretched to hug or hold me. I wanted none of it. I slapped her arms away and stepped back. Stay away from me. I want nothing to do with you. Just leave me alone. Jim, please, you can't mean that, she begged, tears streaming down her face. I do mean it. Stay away from me. I love you, Jim, and I won't give you up. I glared at her, my voice cold and unrelenting. I'll walk away from you if you try to touch me again. Giving up on this marriage is no longer your choice, Jamie. You threw that choice away when you went to that motel with Walter Matthews. You slammed the door shut when you stayed with him that weekend, and planned to do it again this time. There is no longer any love in my heart for you. You've killed all of it with your betrayal. Jamie collapsed to the floor, both hands clutching her head as my words hammered home the finality of our marriage's end. I watched her as she sat there, broken, no longer my wife in any meaningful way. She was still Jamie Parker, but she would never again be Jamie Schwann, wife of Jim Schwann. That role was over, and I had already begun taking steps to reclaim my life. What she didn't know yet was the plan I had in motion to address her lover. I had intended to leave the house before this conversation, but things had gotten a little rushed. I'll sleep in the spare room until I move out, I told her flatly. You'd better stay away from me. Don't talk to me. Janet knows everything, so she understands. Jamie didn't seem to be listening. Her face remained buried in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. I turned and went upstairs to move my things into the spare room. I would pack most of my belongings later, but I needed a few essentials now. When I entered the bathroom to grab my toiletries, I saw the wedding ring still hanging on the mirror where I had left it. I looked at it for a long moment, then turned away, leaving it there. A few days later, I was sitting in the den, working on some papers to ensure everything was ready to be filed. I wanted the legal process to move quickly and smoothly. The phone rang, and since I wasn't sure if Jamie was home, I answered. To my surprise, I must have picked it up at the exact moment Jamie did, because I heard her subdued, quiet voice say, "Hello." To my greater surprise, it was Walter Matthews on the other end. I quickly covered the mouthpiece and listened. "Jamie, it's me, Walter. What's going on?" he said, his tone agitated. "Walter, I told you never to call me here," Jamie hissed. "I told you I never wanted to see you or talk to you again. So why are you calling? Did you know your husband has filed a lawsuit against me in court for alienation of affections?" Walter snapped. "He filed it in Cleveland. He had me served at home in front of my wife and kids. He's suing me for $1 million. Jamie's gasp was audible. "He's what? Oh my God." I knew he found out, but I didn't know he'd go this far. I heard a smothered laugh escape her before she continued, venom in her voice. "I'm sorry, Walter, but it's out of my hands. Guess you'll have to tell your wife now, won't you? Guess your broken marriage is really going to fall apart now, you deceitful bastard. After all the lies you told me about your broken marriage, your hated wife, your pending divorce, you deserve this. So go to hell." She slammed the phone down while Walter was still yelling. I stayed quiet, listening until his voice finally gave up and the line went dead. Then I gently placed the receiver back in its cradle, shaking my head. From what I had overheard, it sounded like Walter and Ruth had cooked up some plan and sold Jamie a bill of goods. She had been naive enough to fall for it, hook, line, and sinker. Too bad for her. She had been too willing to be led by the nose, first by her mother and then by her lover, and too willing to turn her back on me and our marriage. That was the problem. It had been too easy. Just then, Jamie walked into the room. She looked at me, her face pale and drawn, her expression one of sadness and quiet resentment. "You had this all planned out, didn't you?" she said bitterly. "You were just waiting until everything was in place before confronting me. I've been married to you for almost 20 years, and I can't believe I forgot your motto. Give them maximum pain and make it hurt for a long time. I guess you're going for the maximum with Walter. How about me? What do you have planned for me?" "For you? Nothing, Jamie, I replied coldly. I really hate what Walter did to me, even if you were partly responsible. He knew better. He has a wife and 5 kids, and yet he got involved with my wife. He's going to pay as much as I can make him pay. And I've even offered to help Margaret, his wife, financially, if she decides to divorce him. Maybe if you play your cards right, you can marry him when she kicks him out. Jamie's face contorted with anger and desperation. You know better than that, she spat. I don't love him. I don't even like him right now. He lied to me about everything. He and my mother. She paused, her voice breaking. I hate her. And I hate him. She looked at me then, with that familiar pleading look she always used when she wanted something from me. Can't you forgive me, Jim? She whispered. Can't you let me make it up to you? I'll never do anything like this again. You know that. Please, Jim. Let me make it up to you. You had your chance, Jamie, and you made your choice, I said, my voice calm but final. Like I said, it was far too easy for you to walk away from me. Too easy by far. You made your choice, and it was the wrong one. I put down my papers, turned off the desk light, and stood. Jamie's eyes followed me, taking in my suit and tie, my freshly polished shoes. She realized I was dressed to go out, and the look of recognition on her face was hard to miss. Don't wait up for me, I said as I adjusted my tie. I have a date tonight, and I probably won't be back until morning. I had a date with Rachel English. She had told me to bring my pajamas, and when I'd asked why, she just laughed and said it might be fun to see me in the morning, ready for a new day. As I left the house, I glanced back to see Jamie standing in the doorway, tears in her eyes. But those tears no longer moved me. 5 days later, I met with John, a close friend, at a local bar. We had a long discussion about my plans, specifically the timing of my divorce from Jamie, and we also came up with a new plan for Ruth. 3 days after that, John came to my office posing as a client. We had an extensive discussion about his situation, and I introduced him to 2 highly effective lawyers I trusted. After 3 hours of planning, John left, ready to proceed with his part of the plan. 5 days later, Ruth was served at her house. Shocked and furious, she charged at John right in front of the process server. The process server immediately called 911, and within 15 minutes, Ruth was in handcuffs, seated in the back of a police car. I assisted John in obtaining a restraining order to keep Ruth away from him for the next 3 weeks. Enough time for him to clean out his house and leave. We had arranged for everything John owned to be transferred into a trust fund for my daughter, Janet. Since John had owned the house before his marriage to Ruth, it wasn't considered part of their marital assets. His financial assets had also been transferred into protected accounts, leaving Ruth with little to claim. John never even had to go to court. The judge, a family friend, ensured the divorce was straightforward, with each party receiving 50% of what they legally owned. Ruth ended up with a settlement of $10,000. By that time, John was already in Thailand, enjoying a fresh start, and the entire process was completed within 3 months. Ruth now lives in a community retirement home, far removed from her previous life. As for my own divorce, it was a much longer, drawn-out process. There were even attempts to suggest marriage counseling, but thankfully the counselor, a friend of mine, efficiently documented the irreparable damage to the relationship and submitted a report to the judge. Having good connections smoothed the way significantly. After a year, the divorce was finalized. I retained the house and was granted full custody of my daughter, Janet. The court had asked Janet about her preference, and she chose to stay with me. Jamie was given visitation rights, but each time she came by, Janet remained distant. She would quickly excuse herself, signaling that she was not interested in rekindling their relationship. Jamie understood she wasn't welcome in Janet's life. In the last 2 years, Jamie has visibly aged. The strain of her decisions, combined with ongoing health issues, has taken its toll on her. Meanwhile, I am preparing to marry Rachel. Janet and Rachel are happily planning the wedding together, and their bond has brought me more peace than I ever thought possible. John is thriving in Thailand. He often calls to share updates about his adventures and his new friends, who, according to him, vary with each call. His fresh start seems to have been exactly what he needed. Walter, on the other hand, faced significant financial struggles after his divorce. His ex-wife successfully argued the financial strain of raising their 5 children, and the judge, another friend, was moved by her story, awarding her the majority of Walter's assets, including his investments and the house. Walter now lives on a significantly reduced income. I had even offered to cover his ex-wife's legal fees, ensuring she had the resources to pursue her case effectively. And Ruth? She still lives in the community retirement home. According to Janet, Ruth spends her days resenting me, blaming me for how things turned out. I suppose karma works in unexpected ways. Dear listeners, what are your thoughts on this story? Thank you for watching. See you next time.